Good afternoon, Dr. Ogundare.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good to see you.
And welcome to Newcross
Thank you.
and Pan Ocean.
Great to be here. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Well, welcome and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're welcome to this special fireside chat in collaboration with Afrissance and Newcross and Pan Ocean. I'm Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani, and today I'll be speaking to Dr. Bolaji Ogundare, Group Executive Director for Newcross and Pan Ocean on the Petroleum Industry Bill, the journey so far. Our main collaborators today, Afrissance, are business transformation and strategy consultants with offices in Lagos, Abuja, Accra, and London. Well, what is a fireside chat without the opportunity to engage? So if you'd like to join the conversation today, we ask you to please go to slido.com. That's www.slido.com, and put in the event code 4282958 to ask questions, which you can of course do anonymously. And you can also follow us on Twitter at AfrissanceF or my Twitter handle at Rolake Akinkugbe. So please join the conversation, and we look forward to taking your questions throughout the course of the chat. Well, Dr. Bolaji Ogundare, I have to ask you, we're in this magnificent office on the 13th floor of this building overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Newcross and Pan Ocean have obviously done amazing things. So can you tell us a bit about the Newcross journey and the Pan Ocean journey within the Nigerian oil and gas space?
I mean, we've operated, again, thank you and welcome. We've operated in this space for over 40 years. But I mean, what is transformational for me was when I think about the fact that less than 15 years ago, within our related organization, we're really a one asset, landlocked asset. And due to a strategic decision by the organization, we have since expanded to be involved in different areas of Nigeria. There are about 4 assets across Nigeria. We're now involved in midstream sectors. We're involved in gas processing and other areas of the industry. So I think in a very short period, as an indigenous company, we have been able to grow extensively within Nigeria and cover most areas of Nigeria.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, what are you most proud of? But I think you've kind of told me that, except you'd like to add anything else to that.
No, I think for me, it's really our ability to be resilient as an organization. And I think about what makes me most proud is probably our people and their commitment to the organization. I mean, when I walk into the building, either walking, see my chairman or my group CEO, one of the things I do is I look at the faces of people and I see people who are committed. I don't think there's anything better than that, and that makes me really proud.
Yeah, and of course, we talk about people, we talk about policy. We're here today to talk about the Petroleum Industry Bill. It's been roughly about 18 months since the bill became the Petroleum Industry Act, well anticipated. And a key question in everyone's mind is, 2 years, almost 2 years on into this landmark act, what do you think the significance of that piece of legislation is for the industry?
When I think of that, the bill and subsequently the act, you're beginning to see transformational acts take place. In fact, I think tomorrow is going to be a landmark event where NNPC, as we have known it, will cease to exist, and it will now be a private company in essence, which is part of what the act does speculate. But you look at the governance of that structure is something that I think makes them more clearly more investment committed as an organization. But what is also very important is the regulatory aspect. And if you know, while we had the DPR before, it's been so important to separate the upstream sector and the downstream sector with very strong leaders that we have in those areas. And so you have the upstream, NUPLC, NMDRA for the midstream, with very strong administrators who are clearly defining the path for the organization. As we've always said as operators, what is really most important for us is create an enabling environment, create the regulations for us, define the fiscal regimes, and these are clearly best defined in this PIA that we have right now in Nigeria.
Now you've talked about operators. How do you think the PIA actually positions mostly indigenous oil and gas companies in the industry? Because the local community actually still accounts for a smaller share of production than, say, the big majors.
Right.
But we know that over the years, many of them have been exiting their assets and selling. So what specifically does this act do to position companies like yourself to scale in the sector?
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that this PIA really does is it encourages, better still, discourages operators acquiring assets and not working those assets. So really what the PIA has done now is define that if there's a period where you're not working those assets, then they have a right to also engage you and allow somebody else to prospect for hydrocarbon opportunities within the same asset as we know it. But the most important part that I think is when you look at it, this PIA has created an enabling environment for indigenous participation in the energy sector. And I like us to think of it pure, even from an energy sector, not just the exploration and production of oil. The PIA has created an opportunity for people to come into the midstream sector, movement of crude oil, processing, providing equipment that are used. It's such a major part of the industry. The services related, the technical services related, we're seeing increasing indigenous participation. And these are all enablements from the PIA. So, I mean, I think recently we had a marginal field bid rounds. I haven't seen such excitement within the indigenous exploration companies as I've seen in the last 2 years in Nigeria. There's a lot to do, but the fact that people are engaging on this, I think is really great.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, people often talk about the fact that Nigeria has a highly skilled energy sector. There are many of our engineers and geologists and technicians and professionals who are working across the global oil and gas sector. So this certainly creates that hope and prospect that things will improve. But if we peel back the layers around the governance institutions, the legal structures, the specifics of the regulatory framework, what aspects of that governance structure, the new proposed governance structure, are you as an industry operator most excited by?
So, I mean, one of the areas where I really think is exciting is delineating the role of, as in my role, the NUPRC, from the Office of the Minister, from the Office of the Minister of State. So one of the things that this act has in particular done is it identifies the Petroleum Minister, the Minister of State, but NUPRC, and it gives significant authority to an organization, which is the authority, that is in principle not politically elected. So this also allows for continuity. For example, the right to extend licenses is now with NUPRC, which I think is very important. It also helps the bureaucracy of the process. I mean, when you think about it in the past, the minister was in charge of regulations. He was in charge of policies. He was in charge of approving license extensions and all areas. Now, a bit of that responsibility has been taken off him, or her, which I think is really good. And then embedded in another organization, which has also been set up, at least for now, with very good professionals that are well known and conversant with the industry. So I think from that area, there is more clarity on how the governance of the upstream industry is going to operate. I mean, for example, right now, they've been very specific about those who are converting to the new PIA terms. And NUPRC is actively seeking engagement with the oil and gas producers, with either the OPTS organizations or the IPPG, which is the Independent Petroleum Producers Group. They're seeking our input as they're making decisions that will ultimately govern the industry. And I think that is really very good.
Yeah, and of course, consensus building is never a bad thing in the industry. Now, one of the big changes that trailed the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act was NNPC as a national oil company. We know that many oil and gas companies have actually been rebranding themselves. So it was interesting to see the main national oil company also rebrand, change its logo from Energy for Today, Energy for Tomorrow, and then become a limited company. Now, if you look at globally, national oil companies like Saudi Aramco or Petronas, do you see an NNPC Limited being able to compete with those sort of global peers in terms of global footprint, technical expertise, production potential? What are your thoughts?
I mean, if I worked in NNPC today, I'll be very excited. Why do I say this? They've literally made it a private organization that can have a proper governance structure, that can raise financing to explore all basins within Nigeria and, if possible, outside Nigeria. But more interestingly, they've also basically enabled NNPC to look at the midstream sector and the downstream sector. In the last 1 or 2 years, and you will see those steps from NNPC, they're really looking at the refinery processes. They're looking at raising finances from international organizations, both within and outside Nigeria. These are things where, so basically they're doing it on their balance sheets. at this point, and they should be doing on their balance sheet rather than on the national treasury, which further enables them to grow as an organization. So yes, they can absolutely compete. And they can also partner indigenous companies. So you would probably start finding NNPC finding specific indigenous companies that they may say, look, we want to work with you on renewable energy, we want to work with you on biofuels, we want to work with you on petroleum products. So I think this really strengthens NNPC to fully explore the world. Recently, I think there was the OVH transaction, which is a downstream transaction, but it essentially gives NNPC access to gasoline stations across West Africa.
And of course, for those who may not be aware, NNPC bought the assets of OVH.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is something that they would not have been able to do in the past. But now as a private company, they can look at any company in Nigeria that they think, look, we want to grow inorganically in this sector. We can go in and acquire that company as long as our balance sheet can carry that.
Yeah, and of course, deep financial pockets is something that a lot of operators always wish for in this sector. And just to remind our audience to please send in your questions and your comments via the Slido platform using the event code #4282958. So, fiscal structure, that is a part of any new law or legislation that can be potentially really welcome or really controversial. And I just had a few aspects of that fiscal structure here. In the upstream sector, under the PIA, the headline rate of tax for a company in the upstream space will be 60% compared to the current rate of 85%. The PIA also effectively reduces the tax rate for companies in the deep offshore areas from 50 to 30. This, on the surface, in my mind, seems to be a step in the right direction. But based on experience, do you think we have struck the right balance between revenue generation on the one hand for Nigeria and incentives to encourage investors to invest in Nigeria?
Right. This is really exciting for someone who is proactive and clearly thinking of a mutually beneficial relationship, which is what I think the leaders and the guys who put the PIA together thought about that. How can we create a competitive landscape to compete with other regions where people are actively exploring? Don't forget, I mean, if you think about it, we're competing now with areas in the eastern part of Africa, we're competing in Southeast Asia for the same capital. So we really need to encourage investors to come here. But the way I look at what has been done is it's an opportunity to bake a bigger pie, of which you can get a smaller piece of a bigger pie rather than a bigger piece of a small pie. So by altering positively the fiscal regimes, we've created an opportunity to encourage more participation, which ultimately leads to a bigger pie. So eventually, at the end of the day, the government actually gets a lot more revenue because more people are investing in the sector.
Yeah, and so the fiscals are not the only thing that drive investment decision-making for global investors. Many people have always said that historically, subsurface risk in Nigeria is not a problem, and what they often see is the above-ground risks. So apart from the regulatory environment, it's the community relations, and we're going to come to that. It's some of the evacuation issues. So I guess as a whole, when you take the more relaxed fiscal rules, looking at it as a whole, how does the PIA address those other issues broadly?
The PIA has actually tried to proactively ensure that there is a symbiotic relationship with the host communities. Now, one of the things I always talk about is when we look at it, and we've experienced this, if a line gets damaged, if a vessel gets damaged, if an oil asset gets damaged, more often than not, it's one of two parties. It's either vandals from outside that we would think about, or people might think it's people from the host communities. More often than not, it's not people from the host communities. What the PIA now does with the host community fund is it creates a long-term sustainable relationship. And I know we're going to come to this a bit later, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But I think once the people who live above surface start to feel a sense of ownership, a sense of commitment to the asset development, there is more commitment to protecting evacuation. I mean, evacuation has been the bane of the industry for the last 10 years. And it's really a challenge for everyone.
How so? I mean, can you give maybe more concrete information around the evacuation challenge?
I mean, so I'll go specifically and just think about what we've dealt with as a country in whole. I mean, for most of last year, I believe NNPC data came out and said we were losing probably up to 40, 50%, above 40, 50% of what was on the NCT, Nembe Creek trunk line, yeah, which is basically in the Delta. So we're losing that much. The Transfocados line was down also for a significant amount of time, less than the NCTL. And the Brass River line is also being down on and off. So when you think about this, what has been consistent in Nigeria in terms of production has been the offshore production, but most landlocked assets that have had to go through pipelines have really been restricted.
Yeah.
I mean, we see the numbers. Nigeria should be at a potential of about 1.8, depending on where you're reading, or 2 million barrels a day, and we're doing sometimes 1.2, 1.4 million.
Yeah, I mean that's been a concern. We've all seen the headlines. You know, you heard about the pipelines, the Focados, the Escravos. Now, the Petroleum Industry Bill has stipulated that players in the sector need to form different companies in order to operate the assets. Now, companies have different business models and structures for different purposes, legal purposes, tax efficiency purposes. Do you see that as a great incentive for you? I mean, what implications does it have for mostly indigenous oil companies who are trying to mirror that sort of integrated oil and gas approach?
No, I think it enables a different sector of the industry to grow. The upstream mindset, I've always told you, the upstream mindset differs from the midstream mindset or from the downstream mindset. And this allows, if you think about it in the past, an oil and gas company that is focused primarily on exploration and production is also responsible for its own evacuation pipeline. So it builds it, it operates it, it maintains it, and it secures it. That in itself is bringing up an upstream and a midstream company, which is doing that. What I think this does is it allows for an independently operating midstream company that is in charge of the pipeline. So the upstream companies spin off their their oil evacuation lines, so that a different company is responsible for that, and they can focus on core exploration and production activities. Also for gas commercialization, when you think about a lot of upstream companies, they have a gas plant. The concept of them working under the same company as a whole is actually quite, it limits growth. From my experience, upstream operators tend to move very slow in decision making. It takes us a while to make final investment decisions, to decide literally anything, because when we move, we have to move with big numbers. For a downstream operator or someone who's operating a gas plant, price dynamics changes every day. A cargo lands at the port, you need to adjust your prices. So that reaction is something that is not inbuilt in an upstream company. So, and that's why I always say sometimes by having this, it allows for a specialized, actually a split of the specialization of the oil and gas sector.
So certainly we can expect to see some efficiencies in the way companies operate in the sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And one other type of efficiency people are potentially excited about is the possibility for the joint ventures to become incorporated. We've heard the examples about the cash call obligations on NNPC's dependency on federal accounts, and the cash squeeze that the government has been facing, and then the delay that causes to the partnerships and the ability to develop assets and bring them online. Are you optimistic about the concept of incorporated joint ventures?
I am extremely optimistic about the concept. I also have concerns about it, but I think the concerns can be easily solved. The biggest limitation we have in the energy sector in Nigeria is access to capital because of our financial sector has really tried very hard, and they've done some really landmark transactions in the last few years. But we've also seen the impact of those transactions on the balance books of those banks. So ultimately, this comes to what I think would enable this is an increase in access to finance by organizations that have an African context to them. So which means we're looking at financing upstream activities, midstream activities, downstream activities from an African perspective. So absolutely, yes. Okay.
And I guess the access to capital is key. One of the things that we've seen with the midstream and gas reforms within the PIA is that the government has created a midstream and downstream gas infrastructure fund to promote investments into the sector where companies can contribute part of their operating expenditure. I believe, that's for the communities fund. But what exactly is the requirement for funding and financing? I mean, if you were to size, in a sense, the requirements around gas infrastructure and what it would take to really develop and consolidate our infrastructure network in the gas sector, what is your thinking on how big that need would be?
What I would tell you is relatively is more than what we used to develop oil and gas. And I'll tell you this, oil production is a lot easier when you don't do it responsibly. In the sense that you produce your oil, you flare your gas. And there's a reason people have traditionally flared gas, because it's a lot more expensive and it's a lot more cumbersome to process it. But it's clearly what is more sustainable and more environmentally friendly. So what is it going to take is clear. I mean, I think about this from the point of, it still comes down to being able to finance the gas sector, because it takes a lot more commitment. Also, I think the PIA has addressed this by reducing the tax regimes around gas operations. This was an enabler by the PIA to encourage people to invest in gas infrastructure. And it's now up to the operators or the entrepreneurs, for lack of a better word, to come in and take advantage of that opportunity. But financing is still a bit of a challenge because there is limited capital access within the country.
And is gas something that Newcross or Pan Ocean is looking at?
This is something that we're actually very excited about. I mean, a few years ago, being about 10 years ago, we got into an exploration activity on an asset, and we found predominantly gas and oil. I mean, predominantly gas and not as much oil. And I think some people actually put their hands on their head and, oh my God, this is horrible. But today we find out it's not. And within our organization, we actually have a gas strategy unit, people who think only of gas. They don't even think about the oil, and they're thinking of the company growth just based on gas. And I think that mindset is beginning to change even across the country, where people are, you'll hear people talk about, in the past they'll talk of Nigeria as an oil country with gas, but the mindset is changing. People are now saying we're a gas country with oil, but we've adopted this mantra a long time ago.
And you know, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because of course, again, in the past, when people found more gas, it was kind of like not the best type of outcome or results. Now, the hope is that the PIA actually makes operators excited about discovering gas in equal quantities or even in more quantities than oil. But there's an aspect of the PIA I wanted to touch on, probably some might deem a bit controversial, and this is around the subsidy removal. There's a part of it that talks about the downstream, the full deregulation of the downstream. And I know Newcross Pan Ocean is not in the downstream, but I thought it would be important to hear your thoughts because the industry is interconnected. Are you optimistic? And maybe optimistic is not the right word, because I presume you're supporting deregulation, but do you see the possibility of Nigeria truly deregulating the downstream market? And if so, what would the benefits be?
For us to be a sustainable country and a sustainable nation and provide for our people, we need to deregulate gasoline. And I say this from two perspectives. One is the fact that the refining capacity currently in the country is minimal, so we can actually not service that sector. But what is also important is the landing cost, from what I gather, for refined petroleum products is a lot higher than what it's being sold for at the pump. The sad part about it is majority of those who benefit from this price at the pump are not the middle class or even the lower class. They're mostly the upper class members of society who have 10, 20 cars in there. But what is important before we focus on full deregulation is provide a sustainable public transport mechanism for majority of the people. If there is a safe, sustainable public transport system that you trust, then I believe it's okay to fully regulate the sector.
And indeed, and you know, the point about the public transport system then brings us to this domain about different energy sources, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. I know you're a big proponent of alternative energy and opportunities to reduce carbon emissions. But we are going to, first of all, take a break around the issue of community relations and ESG. In a world where globally environmental, social, and governance requirements are deepening, do you think that the PIA sets the right level of contributions from oil companies' operating expenditures to contribute 3% to this host community fund? Or do you think we're just scratching the surface of that need?
why I think it's important that we do things that are sustainable rather than setting our limits is because each community is going to need different things. What I think the 3% starts to do is do a needs assessment, community by community. And I'll give an example. If you're somewhere around Bonny community, which has been invested heavily into, the needs assessment may be less than a riverine community that is further out and has not actually had power for a long time. And each community needs different things. So one of the things I've said is when people were talking, should it be 3%, should it be 5%? I'm like, let's consistently do 3% and measure the impact of that 3%. And if we find that more is needed, then there clearly should be a path to increase that. But whether it's 3% or 5%, to be honest, is a bit arbitrary because people have just guessed it should be 3%, it should be 5%. Let's measure 3% of an operating budget, expend it appropriately on a needs assessment of what that community needs and measure the impact. Then we'll decide, okay, you know what, we need to increase this to 5, we need to reduce this to 2. It probably wouldn't go down.
Yeah, it's not likely to go down.
It's not going to go down.
Yeah, but I think you make a good point because companies still have their own community development programs that they do. So there could potentially be more money, but at least you start with some consistent level of investment. Now, how confident are you that the funds will be appropriated in the right way, given some of the historical concerns around governance?
Yes. At least from my experience, the NUPRC is actually doing a very deep dive into ensuring that there's proper governance around how the funds are set up and who administers the fund. I'll use an example where some of our host communities nominated people and NUPRC was not basically look for criteria, increase the criteria or increase, basically ask for more due diligence on those who were going to sit on this committee. I think this is a step in the right direction. What I always tell people is, let's just get into it and practicalize it and make sure we have good governance and we learn from it. This is a trial of something that we all believe will work. So we'll learn from it.
Yeah, and you know, the world is moving rapidly towards standardizing ESG reporting. Nigeria doesn't have a framework yet. Can you conceive a world in which there is an industry-wide standard that's introduced for environmental, social, and governance reporting by all oil and gas companies in Nigeria, such that it even becomes law?
Yes. Do I conceive that world yet? No, but I think it's a responsibility. I actually think it's a strong corporate responsibility of organizations to embrace the ESG standards and voluntarily or involuntarily report on them. In some societies, it's been tied to access to financing, and the cost of capital can actually vary based on your ESG compliance. We're not yet there. But I think in some countries, probably in the Western world, you're seeing that. Invariably, we're going to get to that level. But we as an organization have started embracing that. We've engaged organizations to work with us and set up ESG goals for us that are sustainable over a period of time. And I think it behoves everyone, especially every organization that is big enough, to ensure that those standards are maintained.
Yeah, good point. Now, we've been getting quite a few questions, and we just wanted to remind everyone that you can go to slido.com, enter 4282958 to ask your questions. There are a couple of questions that have come through. One of them is really around what the impact of the PIA in employment and recruitment within the industry will be. As you know, we obviously live in a world where a lot of young, talented professionals are leaving not just the industry, but Nigeria. And so how do you think this PIA really positions the future labor force of the oil and gas sector?
You know, I think I was attending a forum, and I'm going to put this out, because she was speaking on the panel in South Africa, and she answered this very well when we're talking about this. Ultimately, we've had, especially the younger generation, migrate out of Africa, and I would say Nigeria very strongly. What I think this PIA does is it creates fiscal opportunities for organizations to grow. On the back of that, organizations can then hire people to work in that force. I mean, the PIA just creates so many areas of business and so many areas, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're seeking work, it creates that enablement for you. Although it does behove on the organizations to also think of have an ethical responsibility to increase their workforce if they want to see the organizations going to the next generations. But the wrong organization would take advantage of the tax incentives and just take them as profit. But a part of it should be used towards employing and training new graduates that would come into the sector.
You know, and of course, you know, trends like digital and innovation are actually reshaping the style and structure of work. And of course, there's a question of diversity and inclusion and representation in the oil and gas sector. So I think it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts on how far you think we've come on the diversity and, you know, inclusion aspect. I was just speaking on a women's panel at SciPec, and, you know, that was the focus. How can we get more women in leadership positions? It'd be lovely to hear what Newcross and Pan Ocean is doing as well.
I would say right now, we're probably not doing very well. And I say this because, and I'm very candid about this, last year I sat in a strategy session where we had all the business leaders discussing the next year of the organization. And there were very few women sitting at that table. And internally, I remember that I was a bit disappointed because I am such an advocate. But as an organization, just like I said, we are intentional about where we want to go in the future. There's no disputing the fact that women are as reliable, as responsible, and as capable as men. Some people will even argue that they might be higher in some scenarios. I won't get into that debate. It sounds like the jollof rice debate between Nigeria and Ghana. But I think when there's capability and there's competence, we should encourage it. We are intentionally, as an organization, focusing on having that balance within our organization.
What sort of things are you trying to practically do to improve diversity?
So when we think of diversity, we think of it in terms of ethnic diversity in Nigeria. We think of sex diversity within Nigeria. So one of the things which we're looking at when we get slots open, we're now beginning to encourage that, you know what, we would encourage females to apply for this. And we have actually intentionally gone out to look for females and encourage them to apply for slots. I know that recently there's some technical roles that we're looking for, and probably a bit earlier, hopefully nobody gets an in from this, but intentionally, we're looking to bring in some females to come and occupy that slot, some of those slots. I personally have challenged a few female leaders within the organization that I want them to be more visible. They should just tell me what they need to be more visible this calendar year, whether it's presenting publicly, whether it's publishing, whether it's leading projects. I've challenged a few females, I won't call out their names clearly here, but I've challenged them that I want them to be more visible within the organization, and I will provide what it needs for them to be more visible and successful.
Yeah, thank you very much for those insights and for leading and for being a champion for diversity. I want us to talk about the global net zero agenda and the decarbonization agenda. And the reason I think this is such an important conversation in light of all we're doing is that the Petroleum Industry Act doesn't spend a lot of time, based on my reading and interpretation, delving into it. And it seems to be a major piece of the puzzle that's missing, because the world is moving. And we're all talking about net zero and decarbonization. And we know that gas will help us transition. But why hasn't this conversation taken center stage in Nigeria so much?
So I always talk about contextual interpretation. First, the Petroleum Industry Act. I do agree that it doesn't go into as much detail about energy transition and the transition towards net zero, but it creates a section for it. And when I talk about the act is an enabler. There's going to be the energy transition program I find it complementary to the Petroleum Industry Act. And so why haven't we really spent a lot of time talking about it? I think because a lot of exploration and production, actually, when I think about it, it's because people have also looked at this as a they versus us conversation. The oil industry is the enemy. The oil industry is the enemy. But what I always tell people is, first, I'm glad and I'm proud to be in the upstream sector of the oil and gas industry. But at the same time, I take responsibility for what we do. And I know that we're heavily focused on reducing our carbon and methane production in our operations. Projects that Newcross have been involved with, either directly by ourselves, Pan Ocean been involved with NMPC, have definitely been at the forefront of this. before even the PIA Act went into place, a lot of people don't know this, but Pan Ocean Oil Corporation was actually the first organization in sub-Saharan Africa to eliminate flaring from its operations under the Kyoto Protocol from the then OML 98. This is, we're talking 2008, 2009, before everybody started talking about working towards a net zero. So as an organization, it's always been in our mantra to focus on how we eliminate carbon production and methane production from our upstream activities, from our production activities.
Have you actually set a specific target or a level for carbon?
So we haven't set a target, but we are aiming towards significant reduction. So I will tell you, on one of our production facilities right now, which we just commissioned last year, most of our production facilities is powered by solar energy, which could have been the alternative. On another one of our OML 98, which I talked about, was the first in sub-Saharan Africa to focus on elimination under the Kyoto Protocol at that time. That was under Pan Ocean. And now in Newcross exploration, we're actively looking at opportunities to eliminate the gas flaring that is taking place in there. But what I find very exciting on that asset is we're looking at it also in terms of nature restoration. So not only are we looking at eliminating flaring from our operation towards the energy transition, we're also now actively looking at how we can actually help to restore nature through the mangrove restoration. It's a long stretch, but it's something that we're heavily committed to. So have we set goals? Not clear goals yet. I believe it'll come out in about a year, but there's already a commitment by the leadership of the organization towards reducing the carbon production in our operations.
Yeah, and I know you're a big champion of alternative energy sources. So you are firing on all fronts, I would say, because if we're thinking of Nigerian having a balanced full mix, we need people to champion that approach. And in some ways, the private sector has to lead. So what parts of the alternative energy sector are you really excited about? And where do you see opportunities for entrepreneurs in that space?
Oh my gosh, this area excites me every time I get a chance to talk about it. One of the things I always talk about is that the biggest people that can make the move towards creating an energy balance are the upstream sector of the industry.
Why is that? How exactly is that going to work?
Have the biggest capital to invest. So if an upstream, and I use an example of the Daystar Shell transaction. When Shell decided to make an investment, whether through All One and acquire Daystar, it was a major move. So they're not talking about a 2 million solar project, they're not talking about a 1 million solar project. It was probably about $100 million transaction. And those are the kind of activities that when an upstream organization decides to support an alternative energy direction, the impact is very well felt. Now, as an organization, we've been quite active, both independently, as in Bolaji myself, but more importantly, as my organization, as our organization. Within Newcross now, we have an organization. We have a subsidiary called NewX, which is heavily focused on looking at alternative sources to generate energy. So we are not going to do it by ourselves. That is not the intention. When we find organizations that are doing things that we like, we will invest in those organizations, which is one clear part of what we want to do. We're actively studying the hydrogen movement. We find it very, very interesting. We're looking at both the green hydrogen and the blue hydrogen. We're looking very closely with the German Nigerian Hydrogen Initiative to see what role we can play towards the hydrogen energy market. But the solar market really looks very interesting for us as well as the waste to energy project, waste to energy opportunities. And I'll take a moment, if you don't mind, that I talk about this, because I think the waste to energy is really quite interesting in terms of the energy generation. But what I think is really very important is the amount of landfills that we have around Nigeria that have waste around them, of which a lot of them are not as healthy. They're really called non-sanitary landfills, because the methane from these landfills leak into the water we all drink and the soil we all drink. So the ability to actually take this waste and convert it to energy that can power thousands of homes and reduces the carbon and methane is amazing. And it's something that we're actively looking at as well.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because waste is one of those things you see everywhere. And actually you're providing a solution and potentially making money from doing so. So
I like the making money.
Yeah, the making money, of course. You are an oil and gas company and not a charity. But, on a more serious note, this issue I think is a really key one to delve a bit deeper into, because 2-3 years ago, I have been following this industry, covered it as a research analyst for many years. And there was this wave of companies, Total and Shell, everybody was rebranding. At Total Energies, New Energies, they were setting up new ventures teams within companies. And a part of me wanted to ask is, how substantial are these changes? Are they just cosmetic changes? But if you look at what has happened in the world now with Russia, Ukraine, that whole move towards the transition is now being checkmated in some ways by the growing energy crisis around the world and the recognition that perhaps in some circles, oil and gas will still remain central to our industrial and commercial needs for years to come. So what do you think the future of that debate is, given these global events?
Absolutely. It's quite interesting. So I mentioned something about being contextual about defining our energy transition, because we cannot match what is going on with Total. As a country, we can't match what's going on with Total or what Shell is thinking. We have to think of what natural resources we have first as a country. We have to think of how to be more environmentally responsible for the natural resource we have. So one of the things I always talk about is we're exploration and production companies. Let's be proud of what we do, but we also have the responsibility of looking at the technology that we can use to reduce the carbon and the methane in our production. Because ultimately, when people talk about an energy transition, the case they have is always about the carbon and the methane, or the fugitive gases, some of the other ones. So if we can address these fugitive gases, in essence, there's nothing wrong with what the exploration and production company does. However, because we know that it is a non-replenishable energy source on the short term, you will need to complement it with the alternative sources of energy. And you'll see this is quite interesting that Germany has gone back to open his nuclear plants and his coal plants. England is reopening in the last few days. Shell, I read somewhere that Shell is actually going all into exploration and production again. And it's all part of this crisis. So the political environment really defines what an energy transition is. And I think it's been defined for Europe. Yeah. We need to define our own.
Our own ourselves. Very, very well said. I don't think I've heard it put that way. Oil is politics, and there's a lot that really happens within that political economy. So we got a question, presumably for a young person, around encouraging youth entrepreneurship in the sector. I know you've evolved in your career over the years, but what do you see as some of the obstacles for younger professionals trying to build a career, make a name for themselves, build businesses? What would your advice be for how to build that resilience and sustainability in an industry like this?
Wow. I feel for the person who's starting out now in Nigeria, because the level of unemployment is quite high. The ability to support yourself independently is quite high without your parents. So I think if I was in school now, or I was in, say, my second to third year graduating and looking at what the future held out for me, I would probably be looking at internships. I'll be looking at opportunities and familiarizing myself with the companies. What I would probably also do is, during breaks in school, find places where I can intern, and also start thinking about entrepreneurship solutions. The truth is, there's so many opportunities that can also be funded. There are many grants that people can look into in researches that you can apply to. And even if it doesn't exist, I'm a big believer in just knock. It's very often, I'm not encouraging this, but very often people just engage me on LinkedIn and they tell me an idea and we look for a way to solve it. Actually, recently, one of our asset managers, in the middle of the cash scarcity and the gasoline scarcity, he launched something on LinkedIn asking young people to come up with ideas on how to solve the money solutions, and he was putting his money behind anybody that was willing to put a study together. And I thought that was so innovative, because the amount of applications it's getting is great. And I think this is really kind of where we start from. But it is tough for the young person now who is trying to start off to get a job. I know that the job market has been very poor in the last few years, and we need to encourage it. There are also things I've thought about, and I'm not sure, but it takes a government collaboration where the government calls company X, company Y, and say, look, we're going to give you a tax break, but you're obligated to hire 20 Nigerians over a 3-year period, over a 5-year period, and give them the employment and the training needed. It's one way to at least encourage people to gain that minimal competency in that sector, and after 5 years they can leave. And I think that is the best way to also create employment, is to create a relationship with the private organizations. Give them a break, give them an enabler for them to hire a number of Nigerians, let them compete for those spots.
Yeah, and of course, NCDMB, the Nigerian Content Development Monitoring Board, has been doing great work over the last few years, not just with young professionals, but also with female entrepreneurs. And one of the things they did recently was I think it was almost a $50 million fund for women entrepreneurs in the space. So, but it would be great to see more progress there.
NCDMB is doing a great job, They're doing a really great job of empowering women.
Yeah. And, from a macroeconomic perspective, the budget was signed into law and assented to by the president about 2 months ago now. And under the budget, the government is forecasting production of 1.69 million barrels a day at a price of $75 a barrel. And what are your thoughts on the realism around those figures? Do you think today Nigeria can consistently produce 1.8 million barrels, of crude oil?
Do we have the potential to produce it? Yes, we actually have the potential to produce a lot more than that. I think the challenges everyone has in the sector for now is how we fiscalize this, how we get it to the fiscalization point. And I see a few things that I believe, if we're consistent about it, can lead the government towards this, but it's not going to be
What
easy.
are those few things?
One is ensuring that there is securitization of the pipelines, securitization of the paths through which people move hydrocarbon. A big drive is the refining process, because ultimately when we talk about production capacity, we're also talking about refining capacity ultimately. I believe if the Dangote refinery comes on stream, that also is an enabler to increasing the production growth, because it's then probably used domestically. But overall, it's achievable, but a lot needs to be done. I mean, I know I talked about it, but security is a big part for everyone. The ability to say you move your hydrocarbon from point A to a fiscalization point, and 0% is missing.
Yeah, and security has been a big one. Companies are spending quite a lot of money, and that actually increases the cost of production if you have to spend quite a lot of money on your security. But I mean, overall, if you take a step back and you look at the Petroleum Industry Act as a whole, in principle, on paper, can you categorically say that Nigeria has achieved the main objective of introducing this bill? Guess what? This bill was introduced when I was finishing my first degree in university. So it's been a long journey. Have we, at least on paper, achieved the basic principles of world-class oil and gas legislation?
First, I am Nigerian, which we all know, but I'm still not going to be biased. I would say yes, and I'll tell you why. One is it addresses a big part of the stakeholders of the assets, which is the host communities. It recognizes them. Two, it's very clear about the regulatory authority over the sector. Three, the fiscal regimes are way better than they were in the past. I mean, and I could go on about that, but those are just three of the quick things, because in creating a long-lasting relationship, I always see the community as your partner. They have to feel a sense of belonging in what you're doing. And I think in that sense, I would say that we've done a decent job. It could be better. As you said, when the fundamentals of the PIA was set, it's a long time ago. Things have changed, so it's a bit behind, but it's better than nothing. And this is what I tell people. It is way better than the old laws that we have.
And would you say that perspective applies across the three different parts of the value chain, upstream, midstream, downstream? It's addressed it equally in every way.
Absolutely it does. I mean, it creates a potential for a viable midstream sector, which means people can then set up midstream industries. It creates opportunities in the gas sector for people, whether you want to go into cylinder manufacturing, gas processing. It creates significant opportunities in those areas. So I think, yes, it does that. But I think a key part that it addresses is the deregulation of the price of petroleum product. When that is fully implemented, and I know it's very tough, it must be done, however, in consonant with providing public transport for people or alternative sources of energy. But for what is national fund that could be used towards healthcare, education, infrastructure, to pay just a few people to bring in gasoline products that will be used by a minority of the economy, I don't think is sustainable.
Yeah, fair enough. And we've come to the point where I want to throw in a few more audience questions now, because we've had such a great and dynamic discussion so far. So somebody asks, what is your take on how operators go about host community sensitization around the PIA, especially because historically companies have been forced to make do, create their little local armies, do things in a certain way because they were just trying to adapt to the environment. Now the PIA has formalized many structures. How can companies actually engage host communities better? And then there's a question around oil and gas startups, not just energy startups, and also oil and gas original equipment manufacturers. What can we do to encourage them? So perhaps you want to address those two first, the community issue and then the issue on startups.
When I talk about the host community, and it's quite interesting the way we always see it, we say, what is the company doing? I always say, what is the host community doing? Because the host community needs to understand that they have to bring their best leaders forward. It doesn't have to be the oldest person in the community or the loudest person in the community, but the person who cares most about the community must also be at that table when you have that forum on where you want to decide. I mean, a lot of potential financial capital is going to be put in the hands of very few people. And we need to ensure that as a host community, you're bringing the best people that care about that community. Sometimes I tell people that it's a community's fault if they're nominating somebody who resides in Abuja to be the chairman of their host community in a community in the Niger Delta or deep in Delta. You need someone who is definitely in the system and understands it. So when I look at how companies go about sensitizing, I think it takes two hands. The company has a role to essentially call what is known, probably I'll call it a sophisticated town hall meeting, where everyone is invited. And then you have a conversation about setting the goals of what you want to achieve. And then you set that group that does a needs assessment, which is ultimately what guides the growth of the community as the oil company also grows, so that there's symbiotic growth of both parties.
Yeah. And of course, there's definitely a need for more sustained engagement that's transparent, that achieves the goals of identifying the needs of particular communities so that the funds are actually utilized in a well-structured manner. Then there was a question around oil and gas tech companies and oil and gas tech OEMs.
I mean, it's oil and gas tech companies. I mean, this is so great. I mean, because you think that oil and gas tech companies have existed for a long time. You see the likes of Schlumberger, you see the likes of Baker Hughes, and you see the likes of a lot of Nigerian companies that are doing tech.
But those are big companies. What about startups? How do we encourage startups?
What I've been privileged to experience is a lot of very young Nigerians who are very smart in the tech space. And they're developing applications that are useful to the oil sector. I mean, for example, in here, we're trying to actually do something very similar to that to encourage almost like an oil and gas setup, incubating it within ourselves, which is basically going into, and it's basically centered around data analytics and artificial intelligence, whereby we're plugging in a lot of, we plan to plug in a lot of our data such that we can actually do a lot more prediction in how our fields behave, and we can basically proactively manage things that are taking place there. So there's a lot of noise, I would say noise, there's a lot of activity around oil and gas tech, but people are funding them. Yeah. Some companies are building them within the oil companies themselves, but some are also developing them outside the oil and gas companies. I mean, I was in an exciting conversation last week where we were talking about ChatGPT and the influence. So ChatGPT is basically this artificial intelligence tool that people are using and can basically almost write your resume or write an essay for you. And people are talking about the role in the upstream sector. And I think it could be very interesting. And these are all tech-based. So funding them could be quite interesting, but I'm sure there are lots of people that will definitely look at them. We definitely enjoy things like that. Around equipment manufacturing, it's interesting. NCDMB actually has probably been on the forefront of encouraging Nigerian organizations that want to get into providing some form of equipment for the sector of some form or the other. The biggest challenge that I've found with every single one of them is, it's not fair to say every single one of them, The biggest challenge I've found with some of them is having the right structure that is sustainable. So an innovative idea, NCDMB comes in, but it doesn't last past a year or two, and they don't actually take the project to execution. So one thing that I think, I guess because I focus a lot on corporate strategy, is a lot of the companies that want to go into equipment manufacturing or equipment supply to focus on how they actually execute what they want to supply. So it's not enough to say, I want to go into it. How are you going to put the steps in place to ensure that you can reliably, quality assurance, quality control, provide, say, a valve or a bolt that will be used in the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, and of course, something we haven't had time to go into is beyond just local content from an employment perspective, is really around local content around manufacturing and sourcing equipment and component parts in country. There was a final question I sort of wanted to touch on, and this is more like if you could distill your advice or wisdom for a young professional who wants to build a career in the sector, who wants to transit into the oil and gas sector, what would you advise that they do or they start to do, perhaps 3-4 points, to build a sustainable career in the industry?
Well, read, network. But if I may, I'll just use, I would say life brought me here, but I've also tried to make the best of it. But one of the things that was very important for me, and it might not necessarily answer this question, was in my role, one of the things I chose early to do when I came into this career was knowing I came from a different background. I came from a dental background. Yeah. I was initially a dentist and I did other things, maxillofacial surgery and all of this stuff before I came here. But I always knew I kind of thought I had good managerial skills, but I'm not a petroleum engineer. I'm not a reservoir engineer. I'm not even an accountant. But what I do is I look for the best people that I can find. People who are comfortable speaking their mind, people who can stand by their opinions, as long as it's guided by wisdom or knowledge, and come into a room and talk to me, because my role is basically create that enabling environment for you, provide everything you need, and then stay out of your way.
Yeah.
And I think that is really what somebody looking to work in that place should be looking for, leaders in organizations that have similar mantras.
Yeah, and of course, finding people who have gone ahead of you and seeking knowledge from them. I was going to touch on the drilling because we started on a personal note. You were formerly a dentist, yes. So you were drilling tooth canals.
Yes.
Now you're drilling wells, horizontal, vertical. And my final question before we end this session was really to ask you how that career pivot has been for you.
It's been challenging. I still, I'm learning every day. I don't think I'm great at what I do yet, so I still challenge myself to read every day. But it was something that I think I had to do invariably for many reasons. But I chose to make the best of the opportunity, which meant if you're given the privilege to transition into a sector, work hard and justify why you're there, and not just see it as a privilege to be there. And that was really very important for me, that I can stand on my credentials, that every day I strive to be the best I can at what I do, and I'm still learning every day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bolaji Ogundare. It's such a pleasure chatting with you.
And you too, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, that's the end of our special Petroleum Industry Act Journey So Far fireside chat with Dr. Bolaji Ogundare of Newcross Pan Ocean in collaboration with Afrissance. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.